Okay, so welcome everyone to the October event on Tabular Editor by none other than the creator of the tool himself, Daniel. And happy to have you in our group. As I already said, I became a big fan of Tabular Editor, and I looking forward to kind of getting this introduction and also like seeing the power of the tool, because once you start using it, you don't want to go without it again. And so looking forward to this. As I said, in the chat, you can ask your questions. I don't know, Daniel, how you prefer doing like short breaks in between with the questions, or we gather them for a Q&A at the end.
Well, actually, I prefer to have an interactive session. So please just put your questions in the chat. I will keep an eye on it on my other monitor. And also put in a few breaks along the way to catch up on any questions that you may have. And I think we will also have time at the end. So we have until is it 8:30 or
no fixed date, no fixed time. So it depends roughly. Yeah, usually I think I scheduled 90 minutes for on the meetup page, but it's just like usually 1 hour plus the Q&A, but we can see.
That's, sounds good.
No strict day. Yeah, okay, then I hand over to you. The stage is yours, and
Yeah, thank you, Christoph. So first of all, my name is Daniel. I work as a principal architect on business intelligence for a Danish consulting company called Capacity. I am a Microsoft Data Platform MVP, and I've been working with the Microsoft BI Stack for a little over 12 years. And also doing some C#.NET programming. I am the author of Tabular Editor, as Christoph mentioned, and I am also involved in something called the Power BI Contributor Program. And what that means is that I am actually able to contribute building and writing code for Power BI Desktop itself. So I'm working with the team in Redmond at Microsoft on actually developing new features for Power BI. So enough about that. This session is about Tabular Editor. Today I will show you first of all what Tabular Editor is for those of you who hasn't used it before, and then I will focus on showing you how you can use it with Power BI Desktop to hopefully improve your productivity and to do some things in a much smarter and faster way. And any questions you have along the way, as I said, are very welcome. If you have if maybe you get some ideas along the session, or if you'd like to know if something is possible, please just fire away, and I'll be happy to answer and maybe show you some of this stuff. So what exactly is Tabular Editor? Well, Tabular Editor actually started back in September 2016, so that's 4 years ago, when I created this tool for SQL Server 2016 analysis services. So back then Power BI was not that popular yet, and I don't believe we even had Azure analysis services at the time, but we did have SQL Server analysis services. Now, as you know, analysis services is this tabular modeling engine, which is the engine that is under the hood of a Power BI data model. So whenever you are importing some tables using Power Query and then creating relationships between those tables, adding measures and so on to your model, you are actually building an analysis services tabular data model within Power BI Desktop. And this data model is exactly what Tabular Editor is very well suited for editing, because Tabular Editor allows you to edit the model in an offline fashion. So what I mean by that is, when I say it's offline, it's because Tabular Editor is only working with the model metadata. And now the difference is that when you're building your model in Power BI Desktop, you are the desktop tool itself is all the time connected to the analysis services instance running behind the scenes. So whenever you make a small change, for example, whenever you add a measure to the model, or if you create a new calculated table or stuff like that, then every time you make this change, then the analysis services engine has to go and update all of the model metadata. It has to go and validate that your DAX expression is correct, and it has to go and recalculate the calculated tables or calculated columns and so on. And that operation can actually take some time to complete, especially if you're working with a large and complex data model. And over time, as your model grows, this will start to get really, really annoying, especially when you're just maybe changing a small expression on a measure or something like that. You have undoubtedly noticed the little working on it spinner that you see on the screen every time you make a change like that. And that is the kind of stuff that Tabular Editor can help you avoid, because it lets you edit the model metadata offline. So any change you make, like adding a new measure or editing the DAX expression of an existing measure, all of that is lightning fast. There is no downtime whatsoever. So only when you hit the save button, Control S is the shortcut in Tabular Editor, that is when Tabular Editor is going to connect to the analysis services engine under your Power BI model, and then it is going to apply the changes at that point in time. So that is where you might have to wait a couple of seconds for the update to complete. But at least that way you are in control of when this update happens. So that was a very, very long explanation, and I probably also have some more information on that exact process on some of the other slides here. But just in more general terms about Tabular Editor. Initially, Tabular Editor only supported SQL Server analysis services models, tabular models, and Azure analysis services tabular models. Since around March or April this year, it also started to support Power BI premium datasets, because at that time Microsoft released the so-called XMLA endpoint. So if you are on a Power BI dedicated capacity, so that could either be Power BI premium or a Power BI embedded capacity, then you would be able to enable the XMLA read-write endpoint, and that means you would actually be able to connect Tabular Editor directly to that XMLA endpoint and make changes directly to your dataset, even without opening Power BI Desktop. And now this slide says, and soon also models within Power BI Desktop. Well, that soon should probably have been removed. This is from an older presentation that I held some time ago. But actually today, Tabular Editor is supported by Power BI Desktop. However, there is some limitations as to what kind of changes you can make to your data model using Tabular Editor. But those limitations will be going away at a future point in time. So one day we will be able to support all of the tabular modeling features of Tabular Editor, even with the Power BI Desktop button. And I will show you some of this stuff later on in the presentation. If you're wondering why the tool only supports analysis services from SQL Server 2016 and onwards, well, that's because at that point in time, Microsoft introduced something called the Tabular Object Model, TOM. Basically, analysis services Tabular also existed before 2016, but it used a different format, which was based on XML and was generally very, very difficult to work with. But since 2016, and for all editions of analysis services that has come out since then, they use this so-called TOM. And I will make sure you get a handout of the slides. I will send them to Christoph, so maybe he can share somewhere. But there's a link here. If you want to know more about what this TOM is, you can follow the link. Oh, and apparently it's a dead link. But basically, the tabular object model is this model metadata hierarchy. So here's an updated link that I will make sure to update in the slides. So basically the hierarchy that you see here on the screen is this metadata hierarchy that describes everything within your tabular object model. So you can see here you have this hierarchy where a model can have one or more tables, and each table can have columns, partitions, measures, and so on. And this is the object model that Tabular Editor allows you to work with. So one thing you will notice here is that there is nothing regarding the Power BI visual. So the Power BI visuals or the Power BI report itself, this is only a tool that will allow you to work with the data model within your Power BI desktop file. So if you were expecting that you would be able to use Tabular Editor to change a bookmark or a filter on a visual or something like that, then I'm afraid I will disappoint you. Tabular Editor will only allow you to make changes to the data model within your Power BI desktop file, not the report canvas or any of the report pages or anything like that. But if you're curious about what you can do with Tom, there's a lot of documentation on that on Microsoft's site. So I encourage you to look at this if you want to know more about how this stuff works. The tool itself is a WinForms application. For those of you who know programming in .NET and C#, it means it's a very lightweight application. The download file itself is just 3 megabytes, and you can download the file off of GitHub. So if you go to tabulaeditor.com and just follow the download link, you'll be taken over to the GitHub page where here you can see the release notes for the latest release, and then if you scroll down a little bit further, you will be taken to this assets section where you can find an installer file, which is the one I recommend that most people download and then install. But there's also a portable version, which is just a zip file containing everything Tabular Editor needs to run on your machine. So if you don't have administrative rights on your machine to install software, then you can actually work around that by downloading the portable version here instead. So I should say one more thing here. One of the Microsoft employees working in the community team, a guy called Alex Powers, has created this really cool walkthrough and introduction to Tabular Editor, where not only does he have a great tutorial you can follow step by step, but he also provided some videos that you can go and have a look at where he goes through all of this in more detail. So I'll make sure to include this link in the presentation as well. And then if you decide, you can go and take a look at his repository here, and then you can have this kind of self-paced learning where you go through his material and discover things at your own pace. So let's move on. I would wager that Power BI and Tabular Editor together provides an altogether better experience than by just using one of these tools alone. So as I mentioned before, Tabular Editor was originally designed for analysis services. And since Power BI Desktop is running analysis services under the hood, well, then we can now do a lot of interesting things using Tabular Editor. I also already mentioned this about the Power BI service that also is running analysis services, so you can use the XML endpoint for connectivity. Here are some more bullets around why you would want to use Tabular Editor. I already addressed some of these shortcomings, especially about the offline experience, which in my opinion is an advantage, and you will see this shortly demonstrated how it works. But also for very large and complex models, I would say that the interface in Tabular Editor provides some more functionality, which makes it easier to sort of navigate the model and understand where measures reside on different display folders and so on, even with nested display folders, and even dragging measures around display folders, as you will see later as well. And if you have metadata translation, so if you want to create these kind of multilingual data sets where the metadata can be translated into different languages, that is even something that is completely not possible to do within Power BI Desktop. But actually with Tabular Editor, it actually works, and we'll see an example of that as well. Recently, Microsoft also announced that you could use tabular model perspectives in order to improve the functionality of the personalized visuals feature within Power BI. But guess what? There's no way you can create perspectives within Power BI Desktop. So that's another example where you actually have to use Tabular Editor to add these perspectives to your model. Tabular Editor also has a scripting engine, which I'll just show a quick demo on later, which can be used to automate repetitive tasks so that you can actually become even more productive than that. It also has a best practice analyzer, so Tabular Editor can actually scan your model metadata for best practices and let you know if you're doing something which is not ideal for various things. It has something called save to folder, wherein it can take the data model and split it out into individual files. So one file for each table, one file for each measure within the table, and so on. And this can be an advantage if you're trying to implement some kind of continuous integration environment or parallel development where you have multiple developers working on the same data model at the same time and using some kind of version control like Git or something like that. And then of course it's free and open source. So if you don't like it, you can just stick to a Power BI desktop. So I see we received our first question here. Isn't there a bug with perspectives in tabular model when you want to edit existing perspectives later on? Not to my knowledge, but maybe you can put some more words on what kind of bug you are thinking about. At least I'm not aware that there should be any bugs in this area.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I tried that because I thought it was a good idea to use it, and when I want to add later on new measures or whatever to these perspectives, there was a message in your tool, okay, that either I have to delete everything and put everything in place again, and then I looked after a solution for that, and I saw other people had the same problem as well, and there was no solution from Microsoft to that because it was some kind of bug or a feature in Tabular Editor, Tabular Models, sorry, and so that's the thing I found. So no solution.
Okay. I am still not aware of exactly what kind of bug. Maybe it passed under my radar, but maybe at the end of the session today we can try, and I'd be happy to investigate if there's something I can do on Tabular Editor's side to fix this. So let's save this for the end of the session, and then come back to it if that's okay with you.
Okay. Yeah. Sure. Thanks.
Okay, so what is the catch? Tabular Editor, I would say, is not for everyone. I would say if you are completely new to tabular modeling, so if you have no clue what the difference is between a calculated column and a calculated measure and so on, well, then Tabular Editor is not going to help you. So the tool assumes that you at least have some experience with building tabular models. That you know how to write DAX code and so on, because there are some I would say missing features in Tabular Editor. So for example, there's no diagram view, so there's no way to sort of visualize how the tables are related to one another, and there's also no DAX intelligence. So as you're typing DAX code, it doesn't come with suggestions on how to type a given formula and so on. Also, there's no data preview or processing capabilities, at least not in the UI itself. But with one of the most recent releases of Tabular Editor, you can actually use scripting to preview the data that is in the model and to even force a refresh of the data. Now, those operations are not really supported for Power BI Desktop, but if any of you are planning to use this with analysis services, well, then it's good to know that these features can actually be done using scripting. And then, of course, since it's an open source tool and I'm the only one working on it, then, of course, there's no 24/7 support. So if something's not working, unfortunately, there's no hotline or anything like that, someone you can call. You are, of course, very welcome to post a question or a bug report or issue on the GitHub site. And someone will usually answer within a few hours, but that's about all the support that we can provide. The documentation, I'm afraid to say, is also lacking a little bit. It's getting better recently since the community has really started to pick up Tabular Editor And so we are starting to see a lot of blogs and tutorials and so on across the internet. But there's no, I mean, there is some official documentation on the GitHub site. There's a wiki that has some of the most basic information you need to get started, but there's no like real in-depth, heavy multi pages documentation like you see normally for typical Microsoft products. So if you are a new tabular model developer, I would say use and familiarize yourself with data modeling in Power BI Desktop first. And then once you start to get frustrated with the standard experience in Power BI Desktop, so when you get frustrated by the little spinner that comes up all the time saying working on it as you're adding a new measure or changing a measure expression, that's the point when you switch over to Tabular Editor, and then you will truly appreciate the difference. So I have a slide here that just summarizes some of the features in the UI, but instead of going over them one by one, I propose we skip right into the demo itself. So let me head over to my Windows machine here. And so the first thing I'm just going to do is to show you on an existing report that I have here. This is just a sales and returns sample provided by Microsoft. Just a standard PBIX that you can download from their website. So the first thing you will notice is that after you install Tabular Editor, if you're using one of the most recent versions of Power BI Desktop, then you will have this little new external tools ribbon up here at the top of the screen. And when I mentioned earlier that I have been working with Microsoft on this Power BI contributor program, this is actually my contribution so far to Power BI Desktop. This little ribbon here that allows you to install and register external tools. This was actually my contribution to the Power BI Desktop code base. And naturally, Tabular Editor is the only tool I have installed right now, but there are actually many others. The community has started to create a lot of these tools that you can just install, and then they will pop up in the ribbon here as additional buttons. Some of the noteworthy tools that you can get today are DAX Studio, which is very, very good for analyzing complex DAX expressions and trying to understand the performance of the DAX query evaluations and so on. And another tool called ALM Toolkit, which is useful for doing incremental deployments or incremental publishing of your Power BI models to the Power BI service endpoint. But for now, for this session, we will focus mostly on Tabular Editor. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to click the little button here, and Power BI Desktop will then fire up Tabular Editor, and Tabular Editor will already be connected to the Analysis Services workspace. So that is basically the Power BI tabular model that is running under my Power BI report. Ashraf is asking if there is a way to remove those external tools from the Power BI ribbon. Yes, so there are two ways you can do it. The first option, of course, is to not install the tools. Then they won't show up. If you still want to install the tools, but you don't want to have the buttons appear in the ribbon, then you can go to, so if you locate on your computer the program files, so I apologize that things are named in Danish here on my machine, but on your program files folder, and specifically the x86 version, if you open that folder and go to Common Files, you should see that there's another folder in here called Microsoft Shared, and there we find Power BI Desktop. And finally, we find the external tools folder here. You can see there are a couple of JSON files. And these are actually the files that define which tools you have in your ribbon. And let me just put the folder here in the chat. So basically, if you just delete these two files, well, then and restart Power BI Desktop, then the buttons are going to disappear. But of course, the next time you install a tool, if the tool puts a file here upon installation, that's what the Tabular Editor installer does. Then of course the button is going to show up here again the next time you start Power BI Desktop. So if you want to completely disable the external tools functionality, there's actually one other option, which is to use group policies. And this way, if you're an IT admin in your company, you can actually push this group policy out to all machines within the company, so to avoid that anyone will have the external tools functionality available. And this is documented on Microsoft's documentation on external tools. So let me just find the documentation for that. So here you go. So I will put the link here as well. So there's this registry setting. You can set this group policy, which will completely disable the external tools ribbon if you need that functionality. All right, but for now, let's move on. So here we have the Tabular Editor representation of our data model. And as you can see here, we start at the model level, then we have the tables. Each table we can then expand, and some of these tables have measures inside of them, others have columns, maybe there are even some hierarchies and so on. And you will notice, for example, here we have a calculated column. You can tell by the little icon here, which is a little different. Here is a calculated table. I have no idea why it's named this way, but over time you'll quickly learn to distinguish these various objects to understand what they are. So the first thing you'd notice here, so let me switch back to Power BI Desktop for a second. So let's say I want to add a new measure to the model. So first of all, just maybe it's not visible on your screen, but when I'm clicking on the expand button here, it takes maybe half a second just to expand this list of measures. So already there, I'm starting to see some lag in the Power BI Desktop UI. And I would say that the model that I have here, I mean, it only has something like 19 tables or something like that. So it's not even a complex model. But even still, with a model of this size, we start to see that Power BI Desktop begins to slow down a little bit. So for example, if I want to add a new measure here, so first of all, I need to wait a couple of seconds just for the formula bar to show up. Then I can type the name of my new measure. Oh, I need to put the cursor up here. And then I type something like new measure, and I put some DAX expression up here. And then I hit enter, and then I wait. So in this case, it took maybe 1 or 2 seconds for the new measure to show up in the field list. That's probably acceptable for most people. But you can easily imagine as this model grows larger and larger, and this operation becomes slower and slower, then things just start to get a little annoying. So going into Tabular Editor, so first of all, you'll notice that the new measure I created is already visible here. New measure, and we have the definition of it up here. So there's actually a two-way synchronization between Tabular Editor and Power BI Desktop. So when you make a change in Power BI Desktop, Tabular Editor will automatically refresh the model metadata to show that change. But now see what happens when I create a new measure in Tabular Editor. So I right-click on the table where I want to add the new measure, choose Create New Measure, and you can see the new measure is just instantly available. I can type in the name of my new measure, hit enter, provide a DAX expression, hit the little check mark to accept it. So there's no downtime at all, and I can even make copies of this measure instantly. So here I simply just pressed copy paste. So very, very simple. And you'll see that there's no downtime whatsoever. And I can make as many of these metadata operations as I want, and it's just lightning fast. But of course, I didn't commit any of these changes to Power BI yet. So Power BI still shows the old field list here without any of the new measures I added. So to actually commit these changes, I have to click the little save button up here, or I can press Control S on my keyboard. So when I do this, you'll see it takes a second or so to complete. And then we will see that now Power BI updates the field list to reflect this change. So if you're working with a lot of measures, a lot of complex DAX calculations and so on, already there, I think you will already start to benefit just from using this. Next up is something like being able to clean up the field list a little bit. So let's say you wanted to create some display folders to make this field list easier to navigate. Well, you can do that in Power BI as well, but it's just much easier and much faster to do in Tabular Editor. So here you can multi-select by holding down the Shift key or the Control key to pick up individual measures. And then if you wanted to put these measures into a folder, you can either just write the display folder string here, or you can right-click choose create new display folder, and then it's going to group all of these meshes into a new folder, and we'll just call it new folder. And you can of course make subfolders just the same. So let's call this subfolder. But not just that, you can also multi-select and then drag all of these objects between folders, and it just works, and there's no downtime. So let's create another subfolder here, and we hit save, and we should see our field list update to represent the new structure that we created here with the subfolders and so on. Oh, and if we make a mistake, we can just use undo. So we can hit Control-Z as many times as we want, and we can get back to the original state just by repeatedly pressing Control-Z, just as we would expect from any other tool, except for Power BI Desktop, which does not let you undo changes that you make to the data model. And you can also, of course, redo, so you can go both directions when you're undoing things. You also saw how we could copy paste, and we can copy paste multiple objects at once as well. So I can select a number of objects, hit Control-C, and then hit Control-V, and we get a copy of them. Now Tabular Editor adds a little one here to differentiate the names, since meshes needs to have globally unique names in Power BI. And again, we just hit save, and then we see the field list updating in Power BI. So all of the new meshes that we created should now appear here somewhere. So here we go. And what else? Batch rename, for example. So let's say that we now have these objects here, and these are called units returned. Let's say for some reason I want to rename all of these to items. So instead of units, I want to type items. So we right-click, and yeah, sorry about that. This menu option is actually missing here. Let me see if I can do it at the folder level. No. Okay, so that's actually a bug, but no worries. We can actually work around that. If you go to File and Preferences, then you will notice that up here there's a little feature, a little checkbox saying Allow unsupported Power BI features. Now, normally I would say that you should not put a check mark in here, because this will actually unlock all model editing features in Tabular Editor. So before I put the check mark, let me just show you quickly what this means. So right now, for example, you will notice that I cannot add new columns to a table, for example. I can only add measures. And also I cannot add new tables to the model. I can add a calculation group, but no tables and no calculated tables. And this is the limitations that I was talking about earlier with Power BI Desktop, and I believe it's even documented here that right now external tools can only that there are only a few write operations that are supported, and these are measures, calculation groups, perspectives. Now, metadata translations is almost supported. There's a bug that you should be aware about according to this documentation. But these are at least the things that Tabular Editor will allow you to edit if you leave the checkbox here unchecked, which is the default setting. But now, unfortunately, I encountered a bug so that I cannot even rename objects or do a batch rename unless I put the check mark up here. So I will do that. And now you will see that a couple of new menu options are available. So for example, now Tabular Editor lets me add calculated columns, hierarchies, and so on. But just be aware that these are not supported by Power BI Desktop at the moment. So Power BI Desktop may crash, or you may even corrupt your PBIX file. So unless you really know what you're doing, I suggest that you leave the checkbox disabled. And then I will make sure to fix the bug so that this menu option, which is the one that I wanted to show you, batch rename, I will make sure to provide a fix for Tabular Editor so that this option will also be available even if the check mark is not enabled. So basically what this feature does, it allows me to do a search and replace in object names. So in this case, I want to replace units with items. So we hit OK, and there we go. All of these measures are now renamed. And not only that, Tabular Editor also takes care of updating the DAX expression of any measures that reference these measures. So when we hit save, things will still work. I should not have any errors in my data model. Now, it could very well be that some of my visuals no longer work, but that's because Tabular Editor cannot go in and update the visuals. So now we see that visual complains that units sold is no longer available, and that's of course because we renamed units sold to something else. So that's a limitation you have to be aware about. If you are renaming measures that are being used in any visuals, well, then you have to go in and update those visuals afterwards. So I mentioned that the Tabular Editor will also update the DAX expression of any measures that reference the measures that you just renamed. So how can Tabular Editor do that? Well, let's go back and remove this check mark again. So Tabular Editor has this show dependencies option as well, which will show you the DAX expression dependencies of a measure in both directions. So for example, we can see here that items sold is also being referenced by items sold PM, units sold variance, WIF price per unit, and items sold PM1. So, and you can even drill down even further to find all of the dependent measures of this calculation. And if you double click on one of them, you can navigate to that object so that you can see the DAX expression over here on the right side on that object that you are navigating to. So this may be useful if you want to know the impact of any DAX expressions, DAX expression changes or renames that you make. So here, this example we had with items sold. So now you can see the DAX reference here points to items sold, but the measure was originally referencing units sold. And we can see that if I go here and I undo my batch rename, you will see that now the DAX expression changes to point back to units sold. So let me go and save this again, and then my visuals in Power BI should start to work once again. Here we go. So a lot of things going on here, and hopefully you can already start to appreciate some of the goodness provided by Tabular Editor for working with this kind of stuff. And actually there's more, because let's say now that I have another Power BI model. So this model, of course, does not have any, this is just a blank new report that I've created. So let me start first by getting some data. So right now you will still have to use the Power BI interface for importing tables into your model, creating relationship, that kind of stuff. Hopefully later on over time we will be able to use Tabular Editor for even those kind of modeling changes as well. But for now I will just use as an illustration. So here I have a SQL Server database with some tables that I want to import. So let me just build a small data model really quick. Hit the load button. Power BI will import these tables, create the relationships. Of course, we will have to wait for that to complete. But now the cool thing is, at least once this finishes, okay, Stefan, good to know that the perspectives thing seems to work. Feel free to reach out if you encounter the issue again, and I'll be happy to look into it. So let's. So now we see I've created just a very simple data model here with a couple of tables. I don't have any measures yet. So what I do is I'm launching Tabular Editor. And now the magic happens because, so one thing I'll notice here immediately is that this is actually a very bad model, because you can see all of these date table template, local date table, and so on. All of these are hidden tables within my model that Power BI has created for me automatically. Do any of you have any idea what these tables are used for? So now we're making the session a little interactive. Does anyone know why we are seeing all of these local date tables?
I think what Power BI does in that case, every column that is defined as a date or date time is internally being already prepared to be used as a date dimension kind of. So if you have a date, for example, it'll already derive the day, the month, the year, quarter, whatever, although you probably don't need it. And I think there's a way to turn that off as well.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. So what we're seeing here is the auto date time feature in action. And this is one of the most annoying features of Power BI Desktop. So I encourage all of you, if you haven't already done so, make sure that you disable that feature for good in the global data load area, because we always want to provide our own date table instead of relying on the one that Power BI creates for us. So make sure you disable this here. And now also for the current file, I am also going to disable auto date time. Because you may encounter some bugs when you use Tabular Editor together with auto date time, because it may refresh all of these tables and change these tables at various different times throughout the life cycle of your data model, and that simply doesn't work very well with Tabular Editor. So make sure you disable auto date time. We hit OK. And this, I should say, is also the best practice. If you ask the Italian guru, Marco and Alberto, for example, they would always say, this is the first thing that you need to disable whenever you start to build a Power BI model. So now I disabled auto date time. If we go back to Tabular Editor, we can see that now all of these ugly date tables have disappeared. So now we just have our clean data model remaining here. So what I actually wanted to show you, so this model here does not yet have any measures. So we want to put some measures in here. Now, one thing we could do, so provided that we had the same tables and relationships and so on between the two models, I could actually just select the measures from this model, hit copy, and then paste them over to this other model. So now I've just copied the measures between the two models. Now, of course, this is not going to work because these measures likely refer to objects that don't even exist in this model. So when I hit save here, I'm going to get a bunch of errors. As you can see, I'm getting many different error messages, and that's because it's complaining that it cannot find table sales and so on. So all of these objects that are being referenced in the DAX code within these measures, well, if those objects don't exist in the model, well, then naturally we're going to get a lot of errors. And in Power BI Desktop, it's going to look like this. So we do have the measures here, but you can see we also get these little exclamation marks saying that these measures are not working. So never mind. Let me just go back here, and let me just undo this and hit save once again. So now we're back to the clean model. So typically the first thing you'd want to do when you get a model like this is you want to create explicit measures. So I know a lot of people, when they are creating Power BI reports, they just rely on all of the numeric columns that they have in their model. So for example, having discount amount and freight. And of course, I know that I can just do something like I can take the sales amount and then I can slice it by calendar year, for example, to create a bar chart. And sure enough, it works. Well, even calendar year doesn't really work because it puts the calendar year down here. Of course, what I have to do is I have to go in and specify that calendar year should not be summarized. So I need to change the summarization to don't summarize. And then the next time I add calendar year to this visual, well, then it should put it on the axis, and so it works. But this is bad practice. So using columns as measures, which is what we're doing here, it's actually bad practice for a number of reasons. So the first reason is that if you are going to add calculation groups to your model at a later point in time, well, then it's not going to work, because calculation groups requires all of your measures to be explicit, meaning that you have to create an actual measure for your columns instead. Another reason why it's not a good idea to use implicit measures is that it's not the person who's creating the report might not necessarily know what kind of aggregation to apply to this measure. Maybe you need an average value, or maybe you need a count or something like that. So it's better to have an explicit measure, because then the report creator will not have to decide how the numbers in this column should be aggregated. Lastly, if you're using Analyze in Excel, or if you're publishing this data model to a Power BI Premium, and someone is going to connect to the XML endpoint using a different client tool that uses MDX for querying the model, well, then they are not going to be able to query the sales amount, because MDX cannot aggregate values in the columns. MDX requires you to have explicit measures in your model. So Excel would not be able to, you would not be able in the pivot table, for example, to aggregate the sales amount. So the first thing you always do when you create a new data model in Power BI is you create explicit measures. Now, of course, with Tabular Editor, we can quickly do that. We can create a new sales amount measure, and then we can type the formula as sum, and then we can just drag the sales amount column up here, and it'll generate the DAX expression for us in this case. And we can hit save, and so now we have our first measure here, the actual sales amount measure that we should be using instead of the implicit measure. And so here we also go in, let me close this one. So here we also go in, and we should probably, we should hide this column. So we make it invisible. You can see now that the text is gray because now we no longer want the report creator to use the sales amount column. They should use the sales amount measure instead. And of course, you could repeat this process for all of the columns, all of the numeric columns that you have on your model. But actually, there's a much better way, and that way is scripting. So here, let me show you a quick demo without going into too much details on what scripting can do. Let me just point your attention to the Tabular Editor GitHub site. Specifically on the wiki, you will find this article called Useful Script Snippets. So this article here, let me put the link in the chat. And then the very, very first example that we have here in the table of contents is create measures from columns. And this script does exactly what we wanted it to do in this case. So let me copy this script. Let me paste it in here in the advanced scripting area of Tabular Editor. And without going into too much details about how the scripting functionality works, the purpose of this script basically allows us to select a number of columns from our model. And then when we run the script, it's going to create some measures for every one of the selected columns. And not only that, it's also going to apply a format string, apply a description to the measure, and finally, it's going to hide the base column. So let me show you how it works. So let's delete the sales amount measure again, and let's unhide the sales amount column. So now we have the clean model without any measures. And now I'm just going to select a number of the numeric columns that I have here. Freight, cost probably doesn't make sense, sales amount, tax amount. That's fine. So now I just control selected a few columns here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the script. And boom, 6 measures created instantly with the correct DAX expression on each one of them. And at the same time, all of these columns have now been hidden. So let's hit save. And here we go. We have the corresponding measures in our Power BI model. So you can easily imagine if you had maybe 50 columns on your table and you wanted to create explicit measures for every one of them, that this approach is much, much faster. And of course, this scripting language, as I said, it's based on C#. If you don't want to sum the measures, well, then you can probably already figure out how you'd modify this script in order to do an average or minimum or something like that. It's actually not that difficult to use, and once you start using it, you are certainly going to love this feature. Also, notice how the description property here has been set for all of these measures. So that means that the tooltips that appear in descriptions are now also provided again thanks to the script. So I see that there was a question there. What if I want to see all my measures and dependencies at the same time, or do I need to always check them individually? Yeah, so that's actually a good question. So with Tabular Editor, you would have to go into the individual measures and hit F3 or show dependencies. Again, if you're not afraid of a little scripting, then there are some options for actually printing out the full, or how can you say, creating the documentation that would provide an overview of how all the measures are related to one another. But that's a little more advanced topic. But just know that it is possible, and you can find some code samples here in the document again. Specifically, this one called generating documentation is probably a good place to start. Oh, good question. Can you modify the script to put those new measures into a folder or a separate table? Well, of course. So so now I just hit the undo button, which basically just undid everything my script did. So what I did initially was I assigned the display folder here based on the display folder of the column. But since the columns were not in any display folder, then the new measures are not going to get a display folder either. So if I wanted to put all of these columns into all of the measures into a display folder, I just provide a string here with the name of the display folder. So let's call this auto-generated measures. And let me once again select the few measures that I wanted to include. when I'm running the script. And let's hit the run button, and there we go. Here is your auto-generated measures now within a folder. If you want to move them to a different table, well, you can do that as well. You will see here I specify that I want to add the measures to the same table as the column C. So in this case, if I wanted to add them to a different table, what I'm going to do is I'm creating a variable here. Let me call the variable destination table. And let's say that for some reason I wanted to put all of these measures on the dim date table. So I'm just going to drag the dim date table in here. So I get a reference to the dim date table. And then instead of calling add measure on the table belonging to the current column, I'm just going to replace this little piece of code here with my destination table variable. And so this means now all of my measures are going to be added to the dim date table. So let's try this once again. So let me select a few measures here and hit run. And there we go. So the columns are now hidden, and magically our auto-generated measures are now in the dim date table instead. Are you able to create a complete BIM model by scripts? Well, absolutely, and I know people who have done that. Specifically, there's a guy called Michael Kowalski who works for the Power BI CAD team, Customer Advisory team. He has this website called Elegant BI, where he blogs a lot about auto-generating stuff using Tabular Editor. And lo and behold, here's an article he created called Model Auto Build, which does exactly what you were asking for, where he's actually building an entire tabular model from scratch. So if you're interested in that, take a look at this article. Some more questions here. Could you please share the modified script? Sure. So the script that would just put the explicit measures into a different table. I will put that in the chat here. I should be able to create this as a code snippet. No, that's not possible here. Okay, so for some reason I'm not able to put a code snippet. I can try to put the full code in the chat, but it will probably not look good. Well, here it is anyway. And then we
can also edit again to the other sources then for everyone.
Come again, Christoph?
We can also edit again when we share the other sources. Then we can also share the script again.
Right. Then there was another question. Can the script also monitor? Does the script can be monitored in the performance analyzer? So I'm not sure exactly what you're asking. Are you talking about the performance analyzer in the performance analyzer within Power BI Desktop? Because that is not really related to the scripts that we're using here. So keep in mind the scripts that we are running here. Those are only used to make metadata changes to the model itself. So it doesn't really integrate with Power BI Desktop in any way. It's just a way for us to automate some of the things that we can do using Tabular Editor. But maybe I'm misunderstanding the question. In that case, please clarify. Okay. So now you've already seen some of the more advanced stuff actually on Tabular Editor with the scripting. Yeah, there are many of other things you can do. So I also mentioned, for example, calculation groups. Calculation groups is this new feature that was announced a little over a year ago that allows you to sort of reuse calculation logic across all of your model measures. And the most typical example of that is the time intelligence. So the way it works is that you create a new calculation group here using Tabular Editor. So you can see I get this. It looks like a new table, but you can see that the icon is slightly different. Let me just collapse these. So you can see it has this little calculator icon here, indicating that it's a calculation group. And we will name this time intelligence. And then the point here is that you can add one or more calculation items to this calculation group. So typically you would have something like for a time intelligence calculation group, you would have something like current period, and maybe you would have something like year to date, quarter to date, and that kind of stuff. And so the point here is that you can actually apply a DAX expression within these calculation items, which is going to change the filter context over which all of your measures are going to be evaluated when you're using the calculation group. So first of all, let me hit the save button so you can see what happens. You can see Power BI Desktop now shows this little warning here that one or more calculation groups needs to be manually refreshed. So we hit the refresh now button. And then what should happen is we will now see that now we have this time intelligence here. So the calculation group just looks like a normal table in our model. And we can even go and look at the contents of this table. So you can see it's just a table that has these three records here. And so that means that when I'm using the calculation group, so for example, let me add some, let me get rid of this. And let's put our calendar date here somewhere on the rows, and let's put a filter on the year, and let's do something like get the where was my measures? They were up here. So let's put the sum of sales amount in here, and now let's do something like filtering calendar year by 2011. So now we have a report here giving me all of the sales by date in 2011. Now, what if I wanted to have the cumulative, so the year to date of sales amount? Well, normally I would create a new measure using the DAX total year to date function to do that. But with the calculation group, I can actually just add that logic to my calculation item here. So in this case, what I'm going to write here is calculate, and then this special DAX formula called selected measure. And this selected measure is actually going to be replaced by whatever measure I am using in the current context. So in this case, actually, instead of doing it with a calculate, let me just use total YTD, selected measure, and then as the second argument, I have to provide the date column, which would be this one here. So I drag that in here. And while we're at it, let's copy this DAX expression over to quarter to date. Let's change this as total QTD, and finally let's copy this and create a MTD calculation as well. And let's save all of this. And now, since I added a new calculation item, I added the MTD item, so I would have to refresh the calculation group again. And now the cool thing is that I can actually just drag in the name column from my time intelligence table. And oh, we get an error here. What's that? Please provide a valid. Oh, yeah, that's because I forgot to put something on the current period. So you have to provide a DAX expression for every one of these calculation items. And this one should just be the selected measure. So for the current period, we do not modify the filter context. We just show the measure as is. So we save this, and we should see our visual updating. So here we go. Now we have for the sales measure, which was the one we used in this visual, we have current period, month to date, quarter to date, year to date, and we should be able to see if we scroll down a little bit that you can see the month to date should reset here when we encounter the next month. Quarter to date and year to date just aggregate all the way up. Now, the reason why this is very cool is that I didn't have to specify which measure I wanted to apply this calculation to. So if, for example, I bring in the freight measure instead, well, then the logic still applies. So this allows you to reuse the calculation logic basically across all of your model measures. And if you're interested in this technique with calculation groups, I suggest you take a look at the video tutorials provided by Marco and Alberto from SQLBI.com, because they have a lot of material and a lot of training articles and videos on how to use calculation groups. Right now, calculation groups can only be added to your model through Tabular Editor. There's no interface or no option within Power BI Desktop itself to create these calculation groups. There was a question on this. Can you limit that to certain measures only, for example, from a display folder? It is possible to limit the calculation group logic so that it only applies to certain measures, but unfortunately there's no way you can do it from a display folder. The way you would do it is typically by having some kind of if here, and then you can use a function called is selected measure, and basically is selected measure returns yes or no depending on whether the measure you provide here is the one that is currently selected. Alternatively, you can use a function called selected measure name, which is going to give you the name of the currently selected measure as a string. So you can have some logic here, like I forget the syntax, but something like if this contains amount, well, then you want to apply the logic, or otherwise you don't want. So that's the way you would use to control when your calculation group logic applies. And again, the guys from SQLBI.com have a lot more material on how to fine-tune this behavior. Does this work for direct query and live connections too? So for live connections, you would have to create the calculation group on the data source. In that case, it means that your data source should be an Azure Analysis Services tabular model or a SQL Server 2019 tabular model, because these are the only other tabular analysis services engine versions that support calculation groups. And same for direct query. It doesn't work at the moment. You would have to wait for a new feature which has been announced recently called proxy models or direct query over AS. At that point, we should probably be able to do something similar to calculation groups, even on direct query connections. Another question here, will it work with switch, so to change a visual in one go from freight to sales? Yes, absolutely. So instead of creating a time intelligence calculation group like the one I did here, you can just have a calculation group that lists all of your measures. So you could type, let's do something like add new calculation group. And then for this new one, you could simply do create new sales, and then just reference the sales measure. And then for the freight, you would reference the freight measure and so on. And then what that means is that the moment you apply this calculation groups, then all of your measures are going to show sales amount if you're filtering by sales, and all of your measures are going to show sum of freight if you're filtering by freight and so on. So there are many different ways you can use calculation groups. Recently, I created, I worked for a customer where we used it to perform currency conversions. And you can even apply dynamic formatting of the format string, so we could have different currencies show up in the actual matrix based on what the actual currency was. So calculation groups actually deserve a full session on its own. It's a very complex topic with a lot of nuances. So if you like this feature, then go ahead and check out some of the stuff that I mentioned earlier. Let's see, do I have other questions here? Okay, I think that covers the questions that we had for now. So a couple of other things I wanted to show you with regards to sort of the standard features in Tabular Editor. So we have already seen how we can copy objects around, copy measures, and that kind of stuff. If we go back here for a second to the list of features, I just want to make sure that I have covered most of the stuff here. Yeah. Oh yeah, DAX formatter is integrated. So if you have a complex DAX expression on some of your measures here, then you can click the little DAX formatter button up here, and it's going to format your DAX code according to the best practices for DAX formatting. And then, of course, if you want to do this across all of your measures, well, then you can do that using a script. So basically doing something like for each measure in selected measures, then we can do something like M expression format DAX M expression. So basically what this little two lines of code is going to do is it's going to format the DAX expression of all of the measures that I have currently selected. So when I run this, it'll just, you can see here it made some model changes. Well, and we can see that now all of these DAX expressions have been nicely formatted. We can also, instead of having to select which measures we want to format, we can also type model dot all measures here in the code, and then it's going to loop through all of the measures that I have in my model and applying the formatting of each of them. So that's a nice trick if you want to tidy up your DAX expression code. There's a few other things that you should be aware about when using Tabular Editor. So, for example, up here on the left side of the screen, you see all of these little buttons up here. These control how what the field list looks like. So basically, what items it's going to show you. So, for example, if you accidentally hit Control 1, then it's going to remove the display of measures. So if you're wondering where all of your measures have gone, then that's probably because you just disabled them up here. So make sure that you include the items that you actually want to see. So in the same way, you can remove the display of columns, hierarchies, partitions, and so on. And even display folders can also be toggled on off. And lastly, also hidden objects. So if you don't want to see all of the columns that have been hidden, well, then you can toggle the display of hidden objects as well. So go ahead and play around with these settings and figure out what kind of layout works best for the work that you are doing. Another feature I wanted to show is regarding metadata translations. As some of you know, the analysis services engine itself actually supports metadata translations. And what that means is that you can provide different localized names for all of the objects in your tabular model. So all of the tables, measures, columns, and so on. And the way it works is that you, first of all, you have to make sure that the default model culture, so basically the culture that you see here, English, and the one translation that is already applied or available in the model when you create it, is aligned with the actual names that you have used for your objects. So in this case, I used English names, products, internet sales, employee. So that's all good. But unfortunately, when you're creating a model in Power BI, Power BI will by default choose the language of your local operating system. So you can see here, if you go into options, and I believe the setting is under regional settings, you can see that the default model language is the application language. So that means if I install a Danish version of Power BI Desktop, for example, then it's going to apply the Danish culture as the default model culture. And that means that I should be using Danish names for all of my objects. Now, a lot of people choose to use English names as sort of the base names or the technical names for the objects, the names that they're going to use in their DAX expressions and so on. And then they apply translations in order to change what is actually displayed to the user based on the user's language. So that is why you should make sure that the names that you apply to the objects are aligned with the default translation. If you want to add additional translations, you locate the language that you want to add here. So let me find Danish here on the list. Let me add maybe also German. So here we go, Germany. And then you can start to translate the objects in your model. And the easiest way to do that is you can either go and take a look at within, so put the cursor on any object and then go and have a look here in the property grid where it says translated names. If you expand this allows you to provide the translated name for this particular object in each of the languages. So in Danish, this would be kunde, and in English you can just leave it blank because you keep using the original name of the object, which was the default culture. And in German, so unfortunately I'm not sure what the German word for kunde is, but I do believe it's it's around about the same as in Danish.
The same, yeah.
And now you can see that the name of the object here turns blue, and this indicates that this object has a translation applied. So another way you can view this is if you go to the translation drop down here, then you can choose one of the languages, and then you will actually see what the model looks like in that language. So now you can see here it says kunde, and then as you have this translation selected up here, then you can just use the rename functionality. So if you put the cursor over one of the objects and you hit F2, then you can go ahead and I apologize, my German is probably not spot on, but you know, you can go in and then you can apply the translations one by one to these objects here. Now, when I save this change, you will notice that nothing happens in Power BI. So, okay, so I have some calculation groups that needs refresh. And now this was probably because of the, yeah, this one has some issues right now, current period. Oh yeah, that's some DAX, that's completely invalid that I forgot to clean up. Let me get rid of this and let me save once again. So here in Power BI Desktop, unfortunately, there's no way that you can test the translations. You would have to publish your model to the Power BI service. Unfortunately, right now, this feature only works for dedicated capacity. So that means you would have to deploy your model to a Power BI Premium workspace or Power BI Embedded workspace before you can actually test the connection to the model in different languages. However, it is planned that this will be fixed so that having multilingual data sets with different translations will also work for Power BI shared. Good. Let's see, what else have we got? We're running out of time a little bit. Yeah, one pretty big feature that I also would like to show you is the best practice analyzer. So up here in the tools menu, you'll see that there's this option here called Best Practice Analyzer. If I open this, you can see right now it's just empty, and that's because I did not yet define any best practice rules for my model. So I could go in, and then for the current model, I could add these rules. Now this is a little complex. You would have to know the expression language to use here to define the rule. But this can be useful if you have some naming conventions or something like that that is specific to your organization that you want to enforce. Because then once you type out the expression for the rule, the Tabular Editor will inform you if you have any objects that do not follow that convention. But instead of going into too much detail on that, what I'm going to do now instead is I'm just going to add some rules from a URL. So we can just download some rules here from the internet. And the URL I'm going to use is, once again, on GitHub. That's this other repository. If we go to Tabular Editor, best practice rules. Oh, here we go. We have this repository where you can see there are a couple of JSON files available here. And the one I'm going to use here is the one called BPA rules Power BI JSON. So you can see this is a JSON document, and these are actually definitions of best practice rules that we can use within Tabular Editor. So we want to fetch the rules that are in this file, and the way we do that is we click on the raw button here, and then we get the actual URL that points directly to the JSON file. So let me put that in the chat as well. And we go over to Tabular Editor, we paste the same URL in here. And then you can see now we have this list of rules. For example, we should avoid division, use divide instead. We should remember to fully qualify column references in our DAX expressions. We should provide format strings. A lot of different things that we should always remember to do when we are building models. We should, something like, yeah, avoid using floating point data types, don't summarize numeric columns, and so on and so forth. So when I click OK, you can see now that I get a very comprehensive analysis of these best practices. And for example, this tool has now detected that I have many numeric columns in my model, which use the default summarize by or the sum, because Power BI set it to sum. But of course, for something like calendar year or calendar quarter, calendar semester, of course, I don't want to summarize these measures. I want this corresponds to setting their the summarization here, so don't summarize. Now we already did that for year, but what about all the other columns like calendar quarter, calendar semester, and so on? So the best practice analyzer tells us that we should remember to fix this. And so we can either go through them one by one, but there's a much better way. So for don't summarize, all we need to do basically is we need to change the summarize by property here to none. And since it's just such a simple operation, well, in this case, Tabular Editor can actually do this for us. So we right click and then we can either choose to generate a fix script or we can apply the fix immediately. If I generate a fix script, we can copy it over to the expression editor here to inspect what this, what kind of change it's going to apply to my model. And what this is doing basically is just setting the summarize by property across all of these columns to none. So I can choose to run it in here, or I can just do it from in here as well, apply fix. And there we go. Now all of these columns have had their summarize by property set to none. And so when I go in and hit save, so you can see it in, so apparently for a date table, no, actually, so what has happened here? Okay, let me just scroll back a little bit. So when I added the calculation group to my model, something actually happened behind the scenes. And what happened was that Tabular Editor changed the setting of this property, discourage implicit measures, to true. And once this is set to true, it actually means that all of the columns in your model will now no longer be available for aggregation in Power BI. You can see the little summarize symbol has disappeared across all of these columns. So actually, in this rule here is actually a little outdated, but the rule exists because it was created before this new discourage implicit measures property even existed in Power BI. But anyway, let me show you how it works even still. So I'm going to delete the calculation group. I'm going to go back here and set this to false, which is what it would be originally on the model. But hang on, just before I do that, let me make sure that, yeah, now we are back to how we were initially. So now I'm deleting the calculation group, setting this to false. And now I'm using the best practice analyzer to get rid of the summarization, all of these numeric columns. Apply fix. Oh, wait a minute. Not yet, because I wanted to show you that. Okay, so now I didn't apply the fix yet. So now you can see all the little summarization icons appearing here because these are all numeric columns. And basically now I go in here, I fix, and I hit save. And here we go. Now they disappeared. And this time we didn't use the nice new trick where we can just set the discourage implicit measures on the model level. And you can see that there are many other of these rules that you can look into. Some of these may not be applicable to you. Well, in that case, you can, of course, just decide to ignore them, either at the individual object or at the entire rule level. And in that case, the best practice analyzer will not bother you again on that item. And you can see also here at the bottom of the screen, Tabular Editor will continuously scan for these best practice issues and let you know if you have anything you should fix. So that about covers the basic features and a little bit of the advanced features as well. You should know there are many other advanced features of this tool. Tabular Editor allows you to, for example, to save the scripts that you create as custom actions, and once you save the scripts as custom actions, you can actually integrate them in the UI. So everything that I have here, for example, count rows on dim product, which returns the number of rows in this table. This is actually just a script that I had previously saved. So I can find the same script in here, live connect count rows. So here's the script that I use for that. So it basically evaluates a DAX expression against my model that does a count rows on the currently selected table. And after I save this script as a custom action, well, then it appears right in the UI so that I can actually extend the user interface of Tabular Editor with my own scripts. And so that way I can improve my workflow over time, easily reusing the scripts that I have. There's also a command line interface. So everything you can do through Tabular Editor's UI, you can actually do from a command prompt as well. That's a more advanced topic. It's interesting if any of you plan on using something like Azure DevOps for doing integrated or continuous integration, continuous deployment. Then you can actually use Tabular Editor's scripting features and deployment features and so on directly from the command line. Yeah, and yeah, lots of other stuff going on. Now it's difficult to cover everything in 90 minutes, but I want to leave some time also for more questions. And yeah, hopefully at this point you have already gotten to see some interesting things that that may be able to help you in your daily life going forward. So yeah, so thank you for the feedback so far. Any questions that you may have, I'm completely open. I still have some time, so fire away.
Yes, thank you first for the talk. Really cool. I think if I follow the chat, you've gathered you've recruited some new Tabular Editor users now.
That's good to hear.
I think one question that popped up earlier was if you have measures created in a report only and connected to a data set with a separate data set, so for example, a live connection.
Yeah.
Can you use it there as well, or?
Yeah, good question. Unfortunately, the answer is no, because Tabular Editor can only work with a tabular model. And the problem is, if you create a Power BI report with a live connection, for example, to analysis services or to another Power BI dataset that is hosted in the service, well, then the problem is that you don't actually have a tabular model locally within Power BI Desktop. You only have a report that points to the actual model hosting your data. And it is absolutely true that even though you only have a live connection and you don't have an actual Power BI model, it is true that you can add measures within the Power BI report, but these are special measures that do not actually live within the tabular model. So these are called report level measures. So here I now have a live connection, and it is you are absolutely correct that I can go in here and I can create a new measure. But this measure does not exist in any tabular model. It just exists within the report as a definition of a DAX expression that can be evaluated against the live connection. So unfortunately, these measures cannot be edited by Tabular Editor. You will notice, though, that if you go here to the External Tools tab, that the Tabular Editor button is still active, even though I'm in live connect mode. And the reason for that is that it tries to let me connect to the underlying tabular model. So you see here, when I click the button, if I have administrative rights on the instance of analysis services behind my live connection, well, then it will just open Tabular Editor with a connection to that instance of analysis services. So now I'm not connected to Power BI Desktop. I am actually connected to my AdventureWorks model on my local instance of analysis services. So this is just to clarify that. But this, if you don't have admin rights on the instance of analysis services, well, then of course you're going to get an error because you need admin rights in order to edit a model with Tabular Editor.
Yeah, thank you. I think no more questions. A lot of great session. Thank you. Totally agree here.